Hello and welcome everybody to another series of Planted Unearthed at the magnificent Stourhead. My name's Sam Peters and I'm one of the co-founders of Planted. In our latest series, titled Cool Design Sustainable Futures, we're exploring how to design places, spaces and systems which mitigate against the twin threats of climate breakdown and biodiversity decline. Last summer, for the first time on record, the UK recorded a temperature in excess of 40 degrees centigrade, while on current projections, and according to the latest UN report, the world is set to experience more unwanted records in the next 5 years, with temperatures likely to rise by more than 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. As we speak, unprecedented forest fires are engulfing vast swathes of North America. What were previously considered once-in-a-lifetime climate events are now almost routine. So in a world which is hotting up, what role can design play, keeping us cool and creating a world where humans can live in harmony with nature and natural systems? Central to answering this question will be the role our financial systems, institutions and wealthiest on the planet, those whose carbon footprint is greatest, can play in averting disaster. Are our economies geared up to make the transition to carbon net zero in time? Is there a political and business will to make the commercial case for nature? Or will historic vested interests prevent meaningful change? To answer these difficult questions and more, I'm delighted to welcome 3 expert panellists far more qualified than myself to this talk titled People, Planet, Profit. First to my left, Julia Davies of We Have the Power. Julia is an angel investor, lawyer, philanthropist and environmental campaigner, dedicating her time, skills and resources to tackling the climate environmental crises and interconnected social issues. Through We Have the Power, Julia's mission is to catalyse practical action by investing in startup companies offering sustainable products and services and providing philanthropic loan and finance to accelerate regeneration. To Julia's left, Siddarth Shrikanth holds a BA in Biological Sciences from Oxford, an MBA from Stanford and an MPA from Harvard. He previously worked in corporate sustainability for McKinsey and has written for the Financial Times. He now lives in London and works in climate and nature investing. And his brilliant debut book, The Case for Nature, sets out with powerful clarity how protecting nature is both the right thing to do, but also in our economic interests. And to my far side, Dr. Maria Carvalho. Maria works in the climate strategy team of Natwest Group to develop financial solutions to help clients achieve net zero. She has over 13 years of experience researching and advising governments, international institutions, and the private sector in addressing climate challenges and rapid technological and societal change. She has worked previously for New Energy Finance in the carbon markets team and Grantham Research Institute on climate change and the environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So to my 3 guests, thank you so much for being here. We're extremely grateful to have you. Julia, welcome back to you. And to Sid and Maria, welcome. So guys, why don't we start this conversation off? It's a huge topic, but just give us a little introduction to yourselves. Tell us a little bit about your experience of financial systems and interaction with the environment and nature. And Julia, just perhaps starting with you, what's your reason for being here?
Right, well, you started with the amateur, really. I'm the amateur on this platform, and I guess I'm the one that tries to address this in probably the most basic level. So I'm here and I'm able to now talk about this thing because a few years ago something happened which meant that I could now dedicate my time to tackling issues that I've been passionate about all my life. I became aware of the what we were doing to our environment when I was a teenager. And that's where my sort of journey to try and live my life sustainably started. But I was able to start really doing something about that when I sold my stake in a company that I helped set up. So by profession, I'm a commercial lawyer, but I was involved in setting up a company called Osprey Europe. We distributed backpacks. And when I sold out of that company, it then gave me the tools that you need to do something about this at scale, and those tools are basically money, because it's money that's created a lot of the problems that we have. It's excessive consumption, and it's money that can enable us to do what we need to do at scale to tackle the very, very serious situation that we've allowed our natural world to get to. And of course, we're part of the natural world. In essence, we are an animal too. So to the extent that we have been harming the systems in the world which enable life to thrive, we've been doing that to ourselves as well. And so that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm able to talk about it. So I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert ecologist. I'm not an expert in finance. So I feel quite humble sat next to two people who have got a lot more knowledge and experience than myself.
Thanks, Julia. And we're going to be talking about some of the projects that Julia's invested in recently, some of which I've been lucky enough to go and see, and they're really quite magical. So, Julia, you've undersold yourself, but we're going to hear more about what you do later on as well. So I'm looking forward to that. Sid, why are you here?
You tell me.
I did invite you, to be fair.
You did invite me. I've kind of been a jack of all trades for a long time. So I've sat between the ecology world, the finance world, to some extent the kind of journalism and science communication world for the last decade. And I'm not very good at any of those things. But what I have found really helpful is kind of sitting at the intersection of those worlds and seeing how we kind of know what we need to do. Because I started off as a conservation biologist. My first hypothesis, back to your framing, was, we need to study nature so we can go protect it. And I think that certainly has a part. There's a lot more we need to understand. We've barely scratched the surface. But even that should be enough to tell us that we're heading the wrong direction. And so I then kind of went off into the kind of business and finance world. I was a journalist for a while at the FT. I've kind of come back into the investing world now, all to try and figure out how we can, back to your framing, make the economic case for nature. The book, The Case for Nature, was, I think part of the inspiration was just this reflection that nature is priceless. We all accept that. But that doesn't mean it doesn't also have economic value that we currently misprice. Often we don't value at all. And that leads us, because unfortunately we live in the system we live in, a system that's finely tuned to make decisions based on economic value. We currently make the wrong decisions because we can't see that value. And so part of what I try to do with the book is, go on a journey across the world. This is not a textbook. I'm not qualified to write a textbook. What it is a journey across the world to meet people who are bringing the case for nature to life in their own communities. And there's a whole range of different things we can go into that. But I think at the heart of it, it was just kind of illuminating the ways in which people can bring this to life and the ways in which you can support. So it's really good to be here.
Well, thanks for being here, Sid, and looking forward to hearing some of those stories through the course of this talk as well. Maria, to you, what's your reason for being here?
Again, you asked me, but no, also because Mairead asked me. So Mairead's the regional director here down for Natwest in Dorset and Hampshire, and I've been really enjoying working with Natwest. So I am actually not a banker, so I joined a year ago. Because they wanted people with longevity of climate expertise and climate policy to join in. And so when the job description first came to me, which was head of climate economics and data, first of all, I'm not a trained economist nor a trained data scientist, but when you're in a place like the London School of Economics, through osmosis, you actually learn a lot. And I worked a lot with them in terms of my PhD research and understanding this. But just stepping back, I've spent the past... I actually got into the environment, and I purposely did my master's in 2006 at LSE because one of the few places in the world that had an environmental policy and regulation master's. And I came there because I come from India, and I just was baffled that in a place like India, where you have monsoons in one time and then severe water shortages in the other. So I was really obsessed with this idea of rainwater harvesting and really understanding how to enable nature and to use that in such a way that could be manageable. But when I went to LSE in 2006, that was the year a very famous report on climate change came out. So up to that time, anything on climate change was science related. But in 2006, Lord Nicholas Stern now released the Economics of Climate Change. And I have to say, for the UK, that was a very prescient thing to take. How do you take the science, but how does policy respond to a global challenge? And it was a very groundbreaking report. I was very lucky that a lot of my professors got to work on it. And since then, I've only worked on climate change, but from the perspective of policy and actually seeing, to the point Sid made earlier, and his, at least the FT article that he wrote about it, which was a very good argument, which is that we really do need to see what the services environment provides, and you need to value it in a real way, because if you don't understand that, and so it's something we call payment for environmental services or even natural capital. This notion of what exactly does nature provide, and if you weren't to have that, what would be the economic cost of actually replacing it? And so it's a very beautiful way in which you can, some people can critique it, and I understand why, but into the purpose of we actually really need to conserve nature and value it and restore it, because we don't have the technologies to actually replace it. They're much uglier. They can't do multiple things. And they would be so costly to do that it's actually more of a case of we really do need to invest into nature. So most of my work has been how do you mobilize the private sector at that time to address climate change. And I was there, part of the work with New Energy Finance was looking at what are the policies that governments had put in place and where in the world were you seeing these kind of vast investments, both in the manufacturing, innovation, and markets, and how did that affect jobs and growth? And so a lot of my research was in that, and that led to advisory work, but really understanding real economy decarbonization. And then I came to Natwest, and so my role in Natwest is both to empower the bank to think through how do you understand economic logics and data as a way to empower the decisions we make and mainstream it in how we do crediting decisions, capital allocations, how we really assess a customer on how they address climate, and then in coming into it as our understanding improves on nature. But the other part I do is food system strategy. So it's our entire food system in the UK, our lending and our work with not just the farmer, but all the way out to the market, and really thinking through how do you get the economics to align to make the business case to the farmer towards regenerative agriculture or climate and nature-friendly agriculture. And so that's a lot of my thinking time at NatWest.
Thank you so much, all of you, for giving us that interesting take on where you're coming at this from. But you used the word natural capital there, Maria. It's a term that I think lots of people in the audience, more and more people are aware of. But can we just actually drill down on that a little bit? And Sid, perhaps if you could just give us a layman's terms description of natural capital, if you may.
So, I mean, all natural capital is, it's a framework to help us think through the value that nature provides to human society. Now, we can acknowledge that some of that value lies outside the economic boundary, right? So there are cultural and spiritual services that nature provides us. They're often the most important ones. We can hold that in our minds of that we need to preserve that. But it also helps us think through some of the tangible economic services. These are the ecosystem services that Maria was referring to. And they can include everything from pollination to fresh water to nutrient cycling to carbon storage to preserve a kind of stable climate. All of these things are things that we rely on, whether we know it and understand it or not. And so, I mean, we're sitting here in this beautiful field. Much of the UK at one point would have had, thriving natural ecosystems. It's now largely agriculture. Now, there are certainly kind of sustainability challenges that come with it, but what we do have now is a system that produces food for over 60 million people. That food relies on natural capital because ultimately it relies on healthy soils, relies on the fact that this land can produce the nutrition that we need, and that's declining over time. And so natural capital can say, okay, what's the stock? And in this case, the stock is the stock of healthy soil. Then what's the flow? And the flow is the kind of annual production of food that we take off it. And I think it also helps to think about, think of a bank balance and then the interest you get on it. We've been drawing down the principal for a very long time. And that's why we're in trouble. And part of what this helps us clarify is how can we start replenishing the stock of natural capital so we can secure our future flows of services that we know we rely on. So that's really all it is.
Thank you. I think it hasn't surprised me you've come to food quite quickly in agriculture, because that clearly it's a huge part of this conversation, isn't it? And Julia, perhaps we'll touch on the Wild Woodbury project that you've worked on. I mean, you saw firsthand how degraded farmland can get, can't you? It's kind of like a bit of a worst case scenario in a way. Can you talk a little bit about what your Wild Woodbury area looked like when you guys first experienced it?
Absolutely. So if I can explain, I've got a number of projects which sort of compartmentalise how I'm trying to do my small bit to help tackle the climate and biodiversity crisis, because having come into some money, I think I've got a kind of responsibility to do that, because I see money as kind of like firefighting equipment. So we're in a biodiversity and environmental, a cost of living, a mental health, you name it, crisis. And I think that people who've got more money than they need to nicely look after their family, they basically have got the firefighting equipment to put out some of the fire that we have and to put in some of the fire breaks we need to stop the fire getting worse. So that's how I see myself now. And when I first got into this position, it coincided with the State of Nature report coming out, which, even though I've been an environmentalist all of my, adult life, and I've always loved the outdoors and nature, the State of Nature report really shocked me because it put numbers on the extent to which we've devastated nature in the UK. And in the UK, we're supposed to love animals, we're supposed to love nature, we're supposed to be, a nature, animal-loving nation. But we basically pretty much wiped out most of the other life that we shared this beautiful country with. And it's extreme, very, very extreme, and it's continuing to get worse.
Can you give a couple of those figures? Because they are quite shocking.
I'll leave it to someone else, Sam. I'm not good on figures.
Okay.
It's bad.
Yeah.
Someone
used a great analogy on the panel, one of the panels yesterday, or a great sort of something that focused the mind, was that when he was a young lad 30 years ago, going on holiday with his parents, he'd get in the car, and I remember this clearly. You drive couple of 100 miles to wherever you were going, and you get there and you'd have this windscreen just covered in insects, and now we just don't see that. You can drive for 200 miles and almost hardly see an insect on your windscreen, but the decline is severe, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it starts with the insects, and obviously that goes up because the birds need the insects to feed, everything else needs the insects to feed, and so we've really allowed it to get very, very bad. So I was in a position where I could do something, and like a lot of people, I just thought, well, the easiest thing I can do, I've got some money, is I can just buy some land, and at least I can allow nature to recover on that land. And people were starting, obviously it wasn't the first time people talked about rewilding, but rewilding was really starting to become a bit of a buzzword because the wilding was, really being read quite widely. This is the book about the Nep Estate by Isabella Tree. So that was my first thought. But I then, to develop that concept, I started talking to all of the sort of nature-based charities that operate in my area. I live in Dorset. So I spoke to the Woodland Trust, I spoke to the National Trust, I spoke to RSPB, and I spoke to Dorset Wildlife Trust. And through those conversations, it really sort of came through to me that actually I'm a lawyer. I might love nature, but I don't have expertise in this area. I'm speaking to people who've got expertise. And actually, addressing this crisis that we have with nature is only one of the things I want to do. I also want to see how much I can do to actually push forward action to tackle the climate crisis and the cost of living crisis. And, and even then we were thinking about the fuel poverty and the fuel crisis, but it hadn't got to the stage that it's got to now. So through conversations, I hit on the idea that instead of buying land myself, what I could do is I could lend some of my money to one of these organisations to enable them to buy some land. That way, that would basically catalyse that acquisition, and I could do multiple. So it happened to be that during this process, some land near the village of Bear Regis came on the market, and the concept of lending to charities isn't something that they sort of jumped at because it's quite a worrying concept, a not-for-profit organisation borrowing money. So it took quite a long process for us to sort of get comfortable with this. So I basically went ahead to try and buy this land. It's about 420 acres. It was being intensively farmed. It was tenanted, so it was owned by a very large landowning family. But they tenanted it out, and there was no one farmer living on the land that this particular bit of land. It was just extra land for various tenant farmers. And whilst I went ahead to try and buy this land, I was in discussions with Dorset Wildlife Trust, who were the ones that were most interested in coming on board. Realised it was a big project, so we needed someone to project manage it. So I donated to Dorset Wildlife Trust so they could take on a project manager. And by good fortune, a fantastic young man called Rob Farrington was looking for a job at that time. So he came on board. And whilst I was busy doing the conveyancing, because it's a long, tortuous process buying land, he got on with looking for the money. And quite frankly, he did a brilliant job. So it took a long time for us to complete the legal side of that acquisition. And by the time we'd done that, Rob had lined up the money to buy the land. So whilst I was, to put some figures on it, the price of that land was 3.85 million. I hope I've got that right because I'm terrible with figures. It's about that. So the idea is I would lend the money. In fact, Rob did such a brilliant job. He managed to get money in from a variety of sources. So in fact, the money only had to be lent for very technical reasons and was in and out very fast. because he'd lined up funding, in that case, mostly from the 2 local councils, and it was funding from nitrate mitigation. So we have a terrible problem in Poole Harbour, which is, an incredible site of special scientific interest for all manner of species, particularly, seabirds. And it's got a dreadful problem with algal bloom because too many nutrients are going into the harbour. So most, if you're going to farm on marginal land that's not that great for farming, the way that has been made to happen is adding lots of, artificial fertilizers. So that's lots of nitrates and phosphates. And those chemicals added to the land get washed into the watercourses, get washed into our rivers, get passed down to the sea, and it's causing massive algal blooms, as well as the problems it's causing in those rivers on the way down. So nutrient mitigation is a pot of money which the council acquire through, they place a levy on developers who want to build in Dorset, and they have to pay money into that pot, and then that pot of money is then used to try and reduce nutrients getting into the watercourses in a different way. And the wonderful thing about that money going to an organisation like Dorset Wildlife Trust is Dorset Wildlife Trust is set up to basically preserve nature in the long term. So that money could go elsewhere. It could go into commercial organisations that are very happy to put schemes in place. Wildlife trusts are there. That's what they do. That's what they're set up for, and they will do it. If they agree to sort of reduce nutrients on land, they will do it basically forever. So that was the first massive success story.
And we'll come back to that and find out what it looks like now compared to what it looked like when you took it on, and it's really quite special what's happened down there. But Sid, if I could come to you, agriculture. Why is it such a huge part of this economic question? And then Maria will ask you about energy, which I know we're coming over some broad, big project subjects, but obviously important topics to cover. But can you talk about agriculture and the role in the economic system?
Yes, I mean, if we step back a little bit, there are lots of reasons agriculture is important to nature. I think in some ways the most important is that the vast majority of deforestation globally is driven by agriculture. We don't see that sitting here in the UK, but something like 90% of global deforestation is in some way linked to agriculture expansion. This is in some of the most biodiverse places on Earth. These are places where, unlike the UK, there's still quite a lot left to preserve, not restore, even just preserve. And so that's the first way in which it's incredibly important. So some of the food you eat and the food system as a whole is responsible for that expansion. Part of it comes back to the fact that so much of that land is used for extensive pasture. So ranching, essentially beef ranching, which is a huge driver of deforestation. We kind of work on this in my day job, but it's not as simple as big bad companies are doing this. Something like 2/3 of that deforestation is actually driven by small scale ranching. So it's incredibly hard to solve, but there's that piece. There's then the piece of agriculture in places like the UK and Europe, where it's been happening for a very long time. Natural capital stocks are incredibly depleted, and we need to find a way of farming for future generations while preserving space for nature. And I think part of that comes back to how you can create these pockets of nature recovery and then corridors across a landscape. So you do have a productive landscape for food that also has space for nature. The way we've currently set it up does not allow for that. And there are ways of farming more, there's better, more nature-friendly farming on the fields themselves. And so that's back to some of what you're describing, where you can change agricultural practices. Some of the lending you're working on can help. Where you can preserve biodiversity in soils, in fields, kind of use things like cover crops, no-till. There are lots of different ways to do this. But I think of this as a whole spectrum. On one end, agriculture needs to just stop. And so, right. No, and this is, at the end of the day, if you're on the Amazon frontier, there's no way you can, the best thing to do there is to not farm that frontier, but let it just stop. And then there are places that have been farmed for hundreds, if not thousands of years, where it's all about nature recovery. And so there isn't a kind of one size fits all to agriculture, it can be easy to get caught up in, palm oil really bad. Palm oil is one of the most productive crops on the planet. There's a reason we farm palm oil across the world. It's because it's significantly more productive than any other oil crop. The problem isn't palm oil. The problem is we're deforesting to grow palm oil. And so we should stop that, not the kind of,
It's a really important point you make as well, though, about the UK. In that we kind of imagine all the deforestation going on in developing countries, or whereas we've kind of already done it here. We've done the deforesting piece. And really important that we're sort of not sitting here in the UK and kind of passing judgment on other countries and seeing what we can do ourselves to improve that situation and regenerate yourself. Maria, the role of agriculture and the issues that they present. Can you talk a little bit about some of the lending that you're involved with in the work you're doing?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons I joined Natwest was because it's the largest lender to agriculture and farmers. And so it's about 30% of the market share lending to UK farming, about 40,000 customers. And the reason why I really was intrigued by this, because agriculture is about, the emissions from agriculture and land use is about 10% of the UK emissions. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it's one of the few sectors in the UK that isn't decarbonizing. It's actually like as much as it needs to be. And it's definitely one of the, what we call the hardest to reduce or abate sectors in the UK, just by its very nature of it, pun intended. Well, the nature of how the incentives for farmers were from the 1950s. So we kind of think about like the way that the current farming is and the economics under that farming is something that has always existed, but it's not. In the 1950s, the government coming out of the war, thinking about the amount of people who would be on this planet, really went for a very industrial way of farming, which was to basically pay the farmer and to create a subsidy which pays the farmer to use your land. That was the only requirement. You had to use your land and they would pay you for it, up to a point that now 40% of a farmer's income, depending on what type of crop and is about 40% is supplemented by subsidies, right? What that led to was also a lot of natural capital destruction. So you're basically taking small plots of land, taking out the hedgerows, which are very important for preventing soil erosion, actually also water runoffs, actually keeping a lot of the nutrients. So you're integrating into large monoculture farms and putting a lot of fertilizer, and at that time it was very unconscious, right? Like the idea was you're trying to increase the amount of productivity of your land, not with an idea of an appreciation of what the detriments would be to nature. So to give some of the statistics for the UK, 70% of UK land is agriculture. 85% of that land is either for livestock or for growing the feed for livestock, but only 32% of livestock meat is part of our nutritional diet. So when we think about the role of nature and in this notion of economics, you actually have to think about an alignment of a lot of things. You have to think about the entire food system and how we grow food and what are the economics that drive it, both from the government subsidy side to the cost of these inputs and the nature of it, to all the way to what the market provides. Because what the 20th century did great was to really master economies of scale, grow a lot, drive down costs, mass source, bring it together. But it created a food system that has so much food waste. Like, I think the statistic here is we waste about 10 million tons of food here in the UK, and yet grow so much. And it's just not working. It's not sustainable, both financially or economically. We really saw that last year, where the Ukrainian crisis, nothing to do with climate, but it led to fertilizer being 400% increase in costs. So many of the other, like about 25% on the input cost for farmers. Interestingly enough, it forced a precision agriculture, what we call all these intensive, what you could actually be a lot more precise on, including fertilizer. Farmers were starting to adopt those behaviors. But for a lot of the things like fuel, it requires a lot of capital investments in order for a farmer. It requires a couple of things: capital investments and actually knowing which are the best ones for my farm. Because a farm is part of a broader ecosystem. What are the things how do you empower farmers to look at one way of farming, switch to another? And so that's why at NatWest, we partner with the Sustainable Food Trust. And what we've done is they have something called the Global Farm Metric, which is a 12-indicator metric that encompasses climate, nature, social, and economic, to help farmers to think and plan for their farm and to develop business plans that have basically shift the way that they farm towards something that's climate and nature friendly, but that's most impactful for their farm. And we lend, and based on how the idea is that how well a farmer develops those business plans, including climate and nature outcomes, and actually resilience to climate and nature shocks, that changes the way we lend.
So many interesting points in there, Maria, but I think if we could focus on something that keeps coming up on these panels, actually, is this idea that we don't need to grow more food. We just need to make sure it's all used properly, and also the role of technology in how that may evolve and help farmers to be more accurate in how they farm the land. Siddarth, do you have any comment around that in terms of consumption waste, essentially?
I mean, waste is a huge problem. I think the stat is something like 40% of calories we produce are wasted, which is amazing. I mean, we choose to pass a huge amount of those calories through animals before we eat them, and there's a kind of inefficiency there. But set those two things aside, I just want to make the point that if I were a farmer, I'd be incredibly risk averse. It's understandable that farmers are risk averse.
Yep.
Right? I spent a lot of time in the US. The average US farmer loses money in a given year. I think that's very similar in the UK. So I think part of our challenge is how do you get over that risk aversion and give farmers the tools they need to make the right decisions, kind of get through the valley, because there may be a few years where yields are more variable before a new system beds in. That shouldn't be on the individual farmer to bear. And so I think, part of the challenge we have is fixing that problem. And then back to the kind of overall, do we produce enough calories? I think, as a world, we've done an amazing job of producing enough food to feed the planet and more. Now, I come back to this because I think it is the elephant in the room that people sometimes don't want to talk about. I do think we can't have the diets we currently have and expect to restore nature.
I was just going to ask you that question.
Yeah. There's no way you can cut it. And this isn't an ideological point. It's purely, the maths don't add up. We do not have enough space for the entire world to have the average UK diet in terms of the amount of meat that the average UK diet contains. And that's actually half the amount of meat that the average US diet contains. So it simply doesn't add up. And so I think we're going to have to find some way. And I mean, there are lots of different prescriptions. I'm not going to offer a specific one, but there's everything from, meat as a treat to alternatives to meat that come from, technology. And we can come back to that. There is this piece around, there are lots and lots of people who have enough calories, but don't have enough protein. And smallholders across the world who then rely on fishing or small-scale animal agriculture to get their nutritional needs. So if as a world we're going to say we need we can afford a certain amount of animal agriculture, I'd rather prioritize that for the people who need it in some of these landscapes, because we can afford to eat better and eat differently and make these choices. So I think we're going to have to figure out how, as a country, as the rich world, meat becomes a treat.
My catchphrase. You've used my catchphrase. That I love that phrase, "meat as a treat," because when I first, going back, going back to being at school and learning about the environmental issues that we were facing then, which were deforestation, soil erosion, and starting to think about people have known about climate change for a very, very long time. That's the point at which I became vegetarian. I've been vegetarian ever since, but not because I think eating meat is wrong at all. I don't think it's wrong. There's two reasons. The predominant reason is basically because it's just not sustainable to eat the amount of meat that we now in developed nations eat, and also there's the animal welfare issue, which for me is also very important. I think we push it in the UK. Again, we consider ourselves a nation of animal lovers, but we get the cruelty done by someone else behind the scenes, and then we like our meat basically wrapped up so it doesn't look like anything like an animal at all.
That's just further disconnecting us from nature,
which is big problem that we have with disconnect. And this concept, about meat as a treat. I was thinking about this today, and I was mulling this over. So a lot of the things that we need to do to tackle the massive environmental emergencies that we are facing, that are, they're monumental. They can be phrased by the media or some people as us having to give up things. Because, you can phrase this in a negative fashion of, you've got to eat less meat, you've got to fly less, you've got to consume less. But I like to think of it in terms of what we're preserving. Because unless we do this, we're losing things that you cannot get back. You can't make. When we lose a species, you cannot make that in a factory. You can't design that in a lab. They are gone forever. And unless we make these changes, that's what's going to happen. It's happening now, and it's going to happen on a greater and greater scale. We are going to lose species. You cannot get them back. And more than that, we are basically sort of delegating the pain that we're not, or the changes we're not willing to make now, to our kids and our grandkids and to people elsewhere who don't have these choices to make, because this is going to be forced upon us, whether we're either doing it willingly and we do it in an organised way and we think about how we're going to do it in a fair and rational fashion, or it's just going to be forced on us, and it's already forced on a lot of people, and it definitely is going to be forced on our kids and our grandkids. So I think it just comes down to, what are our responsibilities? And I feel strongly that, I'm a parent. I start with my responsibilities as a parent, but I also start with my responsibilities to everything that I care about. And I absolutely, for me, it's painful, the thought that we're losing species, because, all of the amazing diversity and the incredible stories about animals and the different things, that they're gone forever once they're gone, and we cannot get that back. So we think we're such an ingenious and clever species. And we are in many ways, but in other ways we are most stupid, because I can't think of any other animals that basically destroyed their habitats. They destroyed their sources of food. They destroy the means for their own offspring to survive, because that's the most basic thing. That's what Darwin will tell us, that everything is about the survival of our offspring, and yet we're not doing that right now. So this question of food. It's a tricky one, because it's so entrenched in our culture. And this isn't about saying that eating meat is wrong at all. It's not saying that production of some meat doesn't form a part of sustainable farming going forward, because it absolutely does. I completely think that, So if we look at wild woodberry, I'll just tell you a little bit about that. So,
well, if I just stop you there for a second, and we'll definitely come back to wild woodberry, but just want to obviously make sure that everyone gets a fair shot at things, and Sid, if you could just talk, picking up on very much what Julie was saying there, and obviously we could do another talk entirely about the media's role in all this, and how the environmental change is presented in the media. But regenerative farming is another big topic, but it's obviously fundamental to this part and what Julie was alluding to. But how do we make a case for farmers, an economic case for farmers? And Maria, I'll be very interested in your thoughts as well on this, but because there is that process, isn't there? There's that time between moving from very heavy industrial farming practice to a more balanced approach. How do we make that commercial case, the financial case?
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is what I spend a lot of my time thinking through, and it's actually what I'm calling the fallow year proposition. Actually, not me, also our sector heads who are ahead of agriculture is... One, in some ways, the commercial case is already being made for two reasons. The agricultural subsidies in the UK across the board, it's starting with England, but all the other devolved nations do have agricultural bills on this, which is basically payments for farmers to achieve environmental outcomes, but it's based on specific activities. And it's unclear from those subsidy payments whether it'll be enough to incentivize farmers to actually do those activities. The second big thing is just the industrial costs of carbon intensive from fuel, feed, and fertilizer are so high that automatically farmers are actually looking at how to reduce their operational costs as much as they can. But those are reactionary things for farmers. How do you then think? And then on the other side is the market itself, which really, just to give you a little bit of context, when the last time I checked this, it was about, farmers' prices are going up by 25%, but food costs, what the average consumer pays is 14%. Farmers are getting hit right in the middle of that, right? And so how do you get the market to pay for farmers to achieve through their green procurement and also through premiums? So these are like some of the factors you think about, and a farmer will have to think through in their business plan. And so when we think about moving towards regenerative farming, which is basically to farm less intensively, let some fields be fallow, what would be the cost of that? What would be the premium to come back to that? And there's so many unknowns with regards to how long will it take for the soils to regenerate, to recoup at who's going to pay you for that at a time when you normally get income from it? And so these are some of the things that we're looking at through different instruments. How do we change our loan, but how do we also get other players and food systems players on board to pay farmers for that and to achieve that.
And if there are farmers in the audience, and indeed, then please seek Maria out afterwards and speak to her about what works for you. What would you need the model to look like? I think it has to work. It can't just be placed down, can it?
So we know like farmers are having to react to real things. What my team are really thinking through is what is the right set of incentives for farmers to be willing to do this. So yeah, thanks. Part of my joke was this is my focus group where I actually get the data and the consensus so we can develop something that's fit for purpose.
I was just to step back a little bit. I think with the climate crisis, I mean, there's lots of issues with the media, but one really amazing thing we've done over the last decade is for the climate crisis at least, we've shifted the conversation from climate action being this nice thing that someone else should do to the stuff of businesses and careers and kind of real economics. Now, no one questions the fact that, solar and wind make money, they make economic sense, but it didn't kind of come into being that way. 15 years ago, it didn't make economic sense. And so there was this nexus of policy action, early business leaders who said, let's take a punt on this, spend some of our balance sheets to make this possible. And, public pressure and activists and new companies and all of that. 15 years later, we look back and say, of course it makes sense that lots of levers of climate action, are in the money. I think with nature, we've done a really poor job of communicating that story. I think we're still stuck in this paradigm of, and I mean, to be fair, the conservation movement has done some amazing things over the last 100+ years. But what it's left us with is a sense of nature as kind of inviolable, that we should just kind of leave it out there, preserve it, and kind of get on with our economic lives. Outside of nature, one, it's led to this distance between us and nature, which I think is incredibly harmful. But two, I think it's also kind of closed off any possibility that it might be, on top of it being the right thing to do, it might make sense for us to do it as a society. And so I think some of the stuff I highlight in the book is, cases of, just like regen ag is a big theme, farmers across the world, but even things like ecotourism, carbon and biodiversity markets, cities and how they can bring nature in to make the lives of their citizens healthier and happier. Now, not all of that is about private profit, but it is about economic logic, and there's a difference there. I think the gains of economic thinking can be captured by society, right? Some of these things are public goods. They don't necessarily have to be private gains for companies, although they can be. But I think kind of changing the media conversation to, we can't afford to go on like this, but actually there are real business cases for this, and there are more and more every day. I think is really valuable.
Almost comes back to what you were saying about food and consumption, and actually, you could flip. You can't eat a steak or you can't eat that volume of meat, but actually you could be healthier, you could live longer, you've got less chance of developing cancer or diabetes. I mean, there's so much positive reasons to do it. Yeah. And it's, that's definitely a talk we're going to do in the future, I think, around the role of the media and all this. But Julia, I'm really keen to talk about Wildwood Woodbury as well, but if I may, and also we're going to open it up to the audience in about 5 minutes, so we just keep things as tight as we can. And apologies for the lack of time. I think we could talk all day up here, but I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Edward Hoare in the audience, so I think he's still out there, but certainly asked a question that got me thinking yesterday to the audience, and that's, do we need to stop using GDP as a measure, as the sort of gold standard measure of what is economic success, and move towards something around global resource management? Or how do you see that GDP question? Sid, again, if I could just ask you that one.
I mean, it's such a silly measure. It really is. If you look at how it works, you realize how mad it is that we calculate GDP the way we do. But having said that, I mean, I don't think there's any prospect of us in the near term abandoning GDP. The only countries that have done it, so Ireland has effectively abandoned GDP, in part because their GDP is so skewed by tech companies that it literally doesn't make sense anymore.
And GDP, just to going back, it's gross domestic product. So what exactly is meant by GDP?
So all it is a measure of economic activity within an economy. And so that's the number of times something is bought or sold. So every time that happens, actually GDP goes up. Exports and imports are adjusted. So effectively, it's a measure of economic activity.
It takes no account of damage to the environment or natural capital degradation or anything like that.
In fact, actually, it's the opposite. So it does if it's extracted. So if you extract oil from the ground or timber or something else, that's GDP. You create GDP. You take, you cut down a forest, you turn that into higher value logs. you're actually increasing your GDP. You turn that into kind of really nice furniture, you've increased your GDP.
So there's
there.
incentives to destroy.
There's incentives to destroy, exactly.
Isn't it? Yeah.
But there are no incentives to do the other bit, which is restore natural capital and value it properly. But I mean, I think my conclusion there was I don't think there's any prospect in the near term of changing GDP. We should work on it. There are lots of people much cleverer than me working on it. But I mean, what I was struck by is even within our current very narrow economic thinking, there are lots of areas where it still makes sense, even in this very narrow frame, to protect and restore nature. And so, part of what I'd love to see is, assume we're stuck with this for the next 5 years, can we start moving on some of the things that do make sense under this system? Because, for example, the fact that subsidy regimes are changing means it may now make sense to protect and restore nature in this country and in other places. The fact that corporates set net zero targets may mean now actually there's an economic incentive to change your supply chains, to source differently. So we're going to have to start somewhere while we still work on the bigger question of what do we do with GDP and how do we replace it?
Really interesting. Maria? Yeah.
I would say that actually completely agree that when GDP was meant for something by Keynes, but to put it to this point on every country and every even political party can determine whether or not their success is based on GDP growth is a little insane. Because it wasn't fit for purpose for that kind of measure on how healthy our society is and how healthy. And but what could be the compromise is how much of your GDP collapses due to nature collapse. And that's some of the ways in which people are trying to develop that commentary, is how much of our GDP does actually depend on nature. And the loss of that nature, how much would it collapse by? That's probably the halfway house until we come up with a much better measure of wealth and a notion of wealth. Because even GDP growth isn't always a helpful indicator of this notion of wealth or inequalities and social well-being or nature well-being. But if you were to have that halfway thing, and it's something that I'm starting to see pick up, particularly when you see the World Economic Forum, they have this sort of crisis index. That's not the right word, but consistently the top crisis is climate change and environmental collapse, because then all your businesses and all the relevance of those businesses collapse too.
Fascinating. Thanks, guys. I guess it's that sort of idea that a tree's worth more cut down than it is actually living in the ground, and how do we go back to a more rational approach? But Julia, we said before we came on stage, obviously we want to talk about some positive things which are happening, and I think we've already done that for different changing way that farming subsidies are coming about, and there is some really interesting work being done there, and there are some technological advances as well, which we're probably not going to have quite enough time to touch on, but that's obviously happening as well. But before we open up to audience questions, Julia, just very briefly, if I may, just to ask you to tell the audience about what's going on at Wild Woodbury now. You got this investment, you had this utterly degraded farm, which was toxic essentially, and the soil was dead basically. What does it look like now? We're about 18 months into the project, or a bit longer?
Yeah, I think 18 months is probably right in terms of when farming started. I mean, I don't want to call it toxic because it was farming and it was producing some food. It wasn't producing a lot of food. And I mean, basically 420 acres, about 17 acres of that was being grazed by male dairy cows that were being brought on for about a year to produce low-grade meat. The rest of the site was basically growing crops to feed to those cows. So this was unproductive. It was unproductive land. It required a lot of fertilizers even to achieve that not a great amount of food production. But it is coming back to nature. But I think the thing about Wild Woodbury is it was the start of something. So the Funding Nature project that started is about people like myself who have some money, putting their money into enabling nature to recover. And it's not just about enabling nature to recover. I talk a lot about the Funding Nature project, about restoring land to nature and people. And that's really important to me because we don't just have an issue with nature in the UK. We also have an issue with lack of access to nature by most people in the UK. So we only have access to a very small amount of land, even though we've got this beautiful countryside, but that's out of bounds for most people. We only have access to 1% of our rivers in the UK. That's crazy. So a big part of my project isn't just about enabling nature to recover, it's also about restoring land to people as well. And the funding Wild Woodbury was the start of a project which now has led to, I think we're on about 19 sites that have been acquired through that project now. And I think we've got over 10 in progress as well. Started out very much focused on the wildlife trusts and charities, but now it's branching out into community acquisitions as well, because one of the big problems that we have with the way that we run our systems is it's all just concentrating ownership of land, ownership of money into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And that has resulted to where we are now. So a big part of the thing that we can do to address that is just distribute it out. So it's not just, these decisions aren't being made by fewer and fewer people, fewer and fewer corporations who are just motivated by profit. And actually people can take back control, and they can take back control of looking after our land, but also producing food as well, which is really, really important, because going forward, things are going to get tricky. They are going to get quite tricky. And the issues that we've already started seeing where certain things aren't available in the shops, that is, unfortunately, that's just the start of it. So food security and giving communities more control over the things that we need, which is, I always think it's land, it's food, energy, so community energy. So it's decentralizing, getting control of our energy out of the hands of these mega, energy companies who've paid out massive bonuses to their directors and huge profits to their shareholders at a time when, pensioners have been frightened to put their heating on. You might think I've gone off the subject of nature, but it's all interconnected, because it all is basically how we've been running our system. And that system has been concentrating, hoovering up wealth, control, power away from people towards private individuals. These aren't elected people. This isn't the government that we elected. This is just a smaller and smaller group of individuals and corporations who are basically their work has resulted in where we are now.
Well, guys, thank you, all of you, for some fascinating commentary and insights as well. We're going to just, at the end, we're just going to open it up for 5 minutes. I do apologise, it's going to be just a few quick questions. I would appreciate some brevity of responses as well. But if at the end, I'm just going to ask you all to just give the audience one thing that they can do on an individual basis to go away with the pound that they have in their pocket and how they deploy it, and for the benefit of nature and the environment. The lady in front here with the Panama hat.
Do you think charities, philanthropy and goodwill will prevent climate change when we have governments who protect unregulated markets and are very hands-off?
Thank you. It's a great question. Sid, to you, and then to Maria, if I could ask you.
No.
Okay.
I think it has a role to play, and charity, philanthropy and goodwill can show the way. But all of our crises are crises of democratic capitalism. This is no exception.
Okay.
I would say so in Natwest we have a net zero target to half by 2050 and by 2030 to half the climate impact of our financed emissions, which means we're completely retooling the way we make decisions and how we lend to be in line with climate and nature. And I'd like to think that the lessons we will have across the financial sector of how you do it.
Thank you.
So it's mainstreaming it.
Julia, I think we know your position, but I would absolutely endorse what you said there about the leadership that Julia's shown. I think it's really inspiring. Lots of questions here, so I might just break the rules a little bit and go a little bit longer into this, because I'd be a real shame to not allow people to ask questions. Wow, lots of questions. Okay, I'm going to go to the lady in the sunglasses on the left, purely because we'll work across as quickly as we can. If we could keep the questions short and concise, give everyone a chance, and we'll just perhaps ask one panel member to answer the question, and then we can move through, if that's okay. So yes.
I often feel like there's a narrative disconnect between food, farming, and nature and economics. Like, how can we have a more human-led intersectional conversation about all of these things so people can kind of imagine another way of doing things?
That's a great question as well. Anyone like to take that one? Or?
We're working with the WWF precisely to create that narrative, right? So it's about how do you align nature, climate, food, and nutrition in such a way that actually gets people excited about what that future is, from what you eat on your plate all the way out to how you interact with landscapes. And we're really making it work for people and across society.
Thank you. To the lady here with the sunglasses. We will get to everyone.
Thank you very much. It's been really inspiring to hear you all talk. We'll try and be really quick. Really interested in the idea of shareholders and investment here, and how do we train shareholders to reimagine what return on investment means? You know, when we're talking about duration and time frame and intangible value that you can get through a regenerative system, you know, we need to train the people who are doing amazing work, clearly. But, you know, you're probably a kind of golden egg, actually. And we need to train people who are investing more to think in longer term. So I'm really interested to kind of hear a little bit about, very quickly, how might we do that?
That's a great question. Sid, if you could take that on.
I mean, I was surprised by this, but at some point in the 1980s, we crossed over from kind of private ownership of public markets to public ownership of public markets. So the majority of capital invested in public companies is your money. So it's public money that comes from pension plans, sovereign wealth funds, university endowments. This isn't actually large private shareholders controlling the world's corporations. It's actually people taking decisions on your behalf. And so a better transmission of your values up to the people who make your decisions, I think, is the answer to some of that, because people don't quite realize that actually most of this large-scale investment is your money.
Fascinating. To the gentleman in the blue shirt with the sunglasses.
Thank you, Maria. I was fascinated by what you're doing. And when you have got, or when your staff have got a farmer sitting opposite them, can you present a superior economic outcome for them from regenerative farming? Number one, net of subsidies, and also what's the playbook for that? Number two, with subsidies. And I've looked at the ELMS subsidies, and you don't get much per subsidy. You've got to stack them. And the bureaucratic and time cost of stacking all those subsidies is so great that the normal farmer is not going to be able to do it. You know, the billionaire with an advisor is going to be able to do it. So as the grantor of capital at this point, can you give them, you know, this nervous farmer the playbook for regenerative, saying, look, on its own, it will probably be as good or better than industrial techniques if you follow this playbook. Number two, here's a way we can either help you with subsidies, or this is how to apply for the subsidies in a better way.
Another great question. Just, if I may, just before you answer that, Maria, the ELMS being the environmental land management subsidy that, if you're not aware of that, new...
And it's specific thing to England. So that's exactly why I'm asking for the case studies from people coming to me, so that we could actually start figuring out what the fallow year proposition looks like. So we have case studies where it's worked. And the question will be, what happens in Yorkshire? Does it apply to something in Cornwall? So that's my point, and this is the researcher in me, is I'm actually going out, and it's part of the work that we'll be doing with WWF, is actually with collecting the data to be able to figure out what does that fallow year proposition look like, and how do we have to adjust our loan to be able to accommodate that fallow year proposition. So we're in the start of figuring that out, but right now, the best thing we have to offer is different case studies and different ways to think through it. But we're literally thinking, how do you change the business plan of a farmer so they're comfortable with this?
Fascinating. Just going to go on this side a little bit. I think that's my uncle in the blue hat there.
Sam, this isn't a planted question.
Okay, very good.
In the 1930s, New York was affected by dust storms due to the soil erosion in the Midwest. That stimulated the American government to take action on soil erosion. Do you think that due to the current bad air in New York, it will stimulate Wall Street to take more action and raise climate change up their agenda?
Great question.
I'll do a quick thing. So I'm finding very interesting that, so the Glasgow Financial Alliance is one of financial institutions that are committed to net zero as when the climate negotiations were in Glasgow. But since then, a lot of insurance companies have pulled out of Glasgow, and then the wildfires happened in New York. I would love to know what their reaction is right now. It's a very good question because the dynamics in the political economy in the US is very interesting. And there's a lot of reasons why the insurance company came out. I'd be interested to see what happens after that. I don't have an answer to you, but I'm also on a wait and see mode.
Fascinating, isn't it? And how, once people see the damage to property, to things they own, things they possess,
they will have to pay it out.
Yeah,
that's 111 million people that are apparently going to be affected by those wildfires.
Wow,
what are you going to do?
Massive. Thank you, the gentleman in the red shirt here. And thank you, everyone, for your patience.
I feel that the problem is with the grants, they're not holistic enough. And I think the accountants should be able to take into account the damage done and also the benefit done, because actually if you're doing damage, you're actually stealing from nature. If you've benefit nature, you're giving to nature and you're giving to the land. And in a way, if it was taken into account into your accounts, everyone, whether you're in industry or farming, would bear the burden of the damage they're done, and they'd also reap the benefit from any good they did.
Yes, you're sort of hinting like a taxation on damage, or something that carbon tax, or that
damage you do would be added to your profits, because you're taking something, and the good you'll do, and it would be a holistic thing that everyone would be affected.
Okay, thank you. Lady down here who's been waiting patiently in the hat. Thank you. Chloe, thank you.
Thanks so much for your talks. So I am learning about economics. I'm reading a children's book. I really needed the basics. And one of the things I come across is there's like the difference between a command economy and then like the free economy stuff. And it seems like, I think you said democratic capitalism is kind of sold on the free economy, do what you like approach. And so when I talk to some people about, okay, well, could we do this differently? They all basically say, oh, that sounds like big government intervention and it's definitely command economy and socialism doesn't work and it didn't work for the USSR, which probably isn't a helpful contribution to the debate. How do you approach that discussion about talking to people who are very in favour of free markets about intervention?
So
I'd like Maria and Sid to answer. So Maria, if you could...
two things. One, the UK actually, it's still a democratic and capitalist economy, but it did something very groundbreaking that you're now seeing replicated across the world, which is it had the UK Climate Change Act, the first government to have a long-term target, and it set up a governance process of an independent authority deciding every 12 years in advance of the target year to set a 5-year target. And what the Climate Change Act did in setting a long-term target and what your suggested target rates would be going forward also required the government to set policies in place to meet those targets. And what's been interesting is the UK economy has grown by 65%, but decarbonized by 48%, the fastest of any of the G countries. So it shows that you can actually enable it to occur. These types of, depending on where you are, it's not for everyone, but you're seeing a replication of how do you create policies in such a way. The second thing I'll say is, very interestingly, we're seeing very interesting dynamics between the EU Green New Deal, the US Inflation Reduction Act, and also what China has been doing for a long time. This is actually the heart of my PhD, is the political economy of green industrial policy. But different economies are creating different ways that work for them to address the climate change situation, but in the context of growth.
Fascinating. Sid?
I mean, my really quick 2 cents would be, there are no truly free markets. Every market that we engage in is regulated because someone needs to set the rules. Think of how, the credit card market without rules around fraud would be incredibly challenging to navigate. But fairly simple mechanisms have made that possible. And so I think it's not at all at odds with capitalism to say, can we regulate those markets better? And even free market capitalism requires central regulation in some cases. And so I just say it's back to that question of how do all these markets that sustain us today function? They function with government setting the rules. And so we need rules.
Thank you. Okay, so we're just going to take 2 more questions, and because we have run quite well over time, but there's so much interest from the audience, it's only fair, so please.
You mentioned net zero a few times, and one of the key parts of net zero is not necessarily carbon reduction, but carbon offsets, which is often done through protection of forests. However, there is a very common thread with a lot of these plans where they are protecting forests which were never under threat, the equivalent being us donating to Stourhead to not chop down the trees here. It was never going to happen, nothing has been offset. So what's the better option in regards to net zero and the targets that a lot of these companies are setting, and then kind of skirting around by doing certain things which don't actually impact anything?
Can I come in?
Yeah,
Because I'm feeling a bit shut out. I'd just like to point out there's lots of corporations out there that like to talk about their net zero targets, including banks. And just as I'm sat on a platform with a bank, I'd just like to point out that our major banks are still funding fossil fuels. So one of the campaigns I'm involved with is a group of faith groups, and they're coming together and they've identified the continued funding of new fossil fuel expansion as violence against children. Because we know that we don't have the carbon budget, if we talk in those kind of terms, to use up the fossil fuels we already have, but the banks are still funding new fossil fuel expansion. So when it comes to carbon offsetting, there's a wonderful video that if you want to understand what basically bull carbon offsetting is, and it's basically it's a guy and he's explaining to his girlfriend how he's offsetting his affairs. So because he wants to play around, he's paying some villages, which somewhere in the global south, that are having problems with marital matters. He's paying for a bit of marital counselling there, and he's giving them a bit of advice on how they can all stay faithful, so that he can play around. And at the point at which his girlfriend says, "Oh, anyone can do this, so I can do this with Tim," he's like, "No, you can't do it." So that basically explains to you what bull carbon offsetting is. So yes, absolutely, we need corporations and we need people that have got the money, as I said, because they've got the firefighting equipment. We need them to use their money basically to capture carbon, to restore biodiversity, etc. But they absolutely must not be allowed for 1 second to allow that to be part of their progress to reducing their own carbon footprint and reducing their impact. And the banks and the financial sector are absolutely, they are the ones that are funding this, as is the insurance companies are the ones that are insuring it. So they always want to tell you about the good stuff they're doing. So BP, they've actually been told off for just telling us about the good stuff that they're doing and forgetting to tell us about the fact that they're still investing in new fossil fuel expansion. And they want to do that now because it's more profitable because of Ukraine. So we need to make sure that we listen to all the wonderful people, and Maria, you're doing wonderful work, and also always the sustainability people, and all of these organisations are doing wonderful work, but we should never let these organisations off the hook for what they're actually doing on a big scale, which they don't talk to you about, which is continuing to fund fossil fuel expansion.
It's a fair point, but it's also entirely fair to give Maria
that's what I said. The Marias of the world are doing wonderful work.
But also a response to where Natwest are on that, because that's a question that's been asked before as well.
Yeah, so two things. One, the reason why I joined Natwest was because it actually signed up to the Science Based Targets Initiative. So it's a very clear, independent framework and standard on what net zero is, which is from your baseline year, so in our case 2019, you have to reduce your own scope 1, 2, so our own operations and also what we finance by 90% from our 2090 levels by 2050. And we are not allowed to use carbon offsets to claim we've met our reduction targets. So that is a very helpful framework for me to talk within the bank, but it was always within the case that they always saw, but the Science Based Targets Initiative is also very clear. That doesn't mean that you're not also emitting. And therefore, in a world where you're seeing a global carbon budget run down very quickly, you do have to go above it. So you can't use carbon offsets to say that you are achieving your own targets. You have to be very transparent about that. And you can see in the transition plan, we're supposed to account every year. But beyond that, you are required to finance projects that will actually support, which would have actually otherwise, you are required to finance those projects. And what is clear is that we are losing our forests. So fair if there's some other places, but I'd rather, instead of real actually academic articles, and the one that came out of The Guardian, no person with, anyways, I don't want to go into that, but you would have to figure out a way to finance and to support those communities who have every reason to cut down their forests because of beef, because that's the poverty they're chain, and say, no, I'll pay you to keep it up. And that is a real financing challenge because so little financing goes towards forest conservation. And figuring out a mechanism that is transparent and accountable is very important. With regards to NatWest and oil and gas lending, we only do 0%. Ironically, the most carbon intensive part of our balance sheet is cows, not oil and gas. 0.7% of our balance sheet comes from oil and gas lending. And it's actually, and that will in fact go out soon because thanks to Make My Money Matter, thanks to actually NGOs holding us to account, last year we stopped reserve-based lending, and we have a policy that says by 2025 we'll honor our existing contracts, but we won't do any new. And we exited 6 out of the 8 oil majors. We're reviewing the remaining 2 oil majors based on the credibility of their climate transition plan. And that's how you make financial institutions held to account, both inside and outside.
Great answer. And from my perspective as well, it was by understanding that and having that explained to us at Planted that and also the fact that Coutts have gone through the process of B Corp certification, which we'll be talking more about on a talk tomorrow afternoon about the rise of B Corp. That is why we agreed to the sponsorship, and I think that's very respectful of all the points that have been made, but a good and a highly articulate response to that fair question as well. Last, there was a gentleman at the back but saying no, he's happy. We've run way over time, guys, but I'm very happy with that because of all the talks I've ever had the privilege of hosting on this stage, and indeed Oliver, I've never known an audience so engaged and so passionate about this subject matter. It's clearly one that we need to talk more and more about in the future. And also huge thanks to the panellists here because the difference of experience and the breadth of knowledge that you've brought to this talk has been absolutely first class. So thank you so much, guys. That just leaves it to me to thank all the panellists again, whilst also thanking Coutts and Natwest for generously sponsoring this talk. Thanks also to the National Trust for hosting us here at Stourhead, our AV production team PYTCH, who along with SolCell have enabled this Planted Talks programme to be powered entirely with renewable energy. If you enjoyed this talk, please visit our website, www.planted-community.co.uk, for more articles, information about some of the issues we've discussed here today, and much, much more as well. In the meantime, please enjoy the rest of Planted Country and take time to visit some of the amazing environmentally focused businesses who we've partnered with here today and this week. Thanks to everyone here for watching. My name's Sam Peters, and this has been People, Planet, Profit.